promised big and has delivered even bigger. On the economic front, after inheriting the worst inflation crisis in over 4 decades, President Trump's pro growth policies are making tremendous progress to make America affordable again. Under the painful Biden years, inflation reached a record high 9% and devoured Americans' purchasing power. In President Trump's term thus far, inflation has dropped to an average of just 2.7%, marking critical progress. The Trump administration is working hard every single day to bring down the cost of living through bigger paychecks and lower.
Watching this clip is watching the machinery of authoritarian propaganda in real time, and we need to talk about how this kind of ideological violence operates, because this spokesperson is engaged in what scholars of democracy call political gaslighting at an industrial scale, constructing a narrative so divorced from material reality that it literally asks you to deny what your own eyes see at the grocery store, what your own bank account tells you when rent is due, what your own lived experience screams at you every single day. Trump called the term affordability a hoax perpetrated by Democrats, this after promising during his campaign to bring prices down on day one, and now we're watching his administration's apparatus churn out this fantasy where Biden created hell on earth, and Trump swooped in like some economic messiah to rescue us all. Except here's what actually happened, and hold on to your seats because the data demolishes this entire performance piece. The year-over-year inflation rate in January when Trump returned to the White House was 3.0%, and in September, the most recent month for which figures have been released, was the same 3.0%, literally unchanged. So all this triumphant rhetoric about Trump slashing inflation is empirically false. It's a fabrication. It's propaganda dressed up as policy analysis. After 40-year high levels of inflation in 2022, under Biden, the Federal Reserve had engineered a remarkably successful path to return to 2%, which has been disrupted by especially Trump's tariffs, and now inflation is at 3% and rising. Economists are literally watching in real time as Trump's own policies are pushing prices upward again. And here's where it gets absolutely infuriating, because while some items like gasoline have fallen on Trump's watch, the overall cost of living has continued to climb, with grocery costs up 2.7% for the year, ending in September, and electricity costs jumping more than 5%. Now let me take you back to the actual origins of this inflation, because understanding causation is how we resist manipulation, and the pandemic-era inflation surge that this clip weaponizes against Biden was fundamentally a supply-side shock. Let me say that again for the people in the back. It was a supply-side shock. The vast majority of the COVID-19 inflation surge is accounted for by supply-linked factors, especially a rise in company margins that followed severe delivery delays at the height of the pandemic, and regardless of which model economists use, supply disruptions explain the bulk of COVID-era inflation. Global supply chain disruptions, following the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic, contributed to the rapid rise in U.S. inflation over the past 2 years, with evidence suggesting supply chain pressures pushed up input costs and expectations of higher future prices, accounting for about 60% of the surge in U.S. inflation beginning in early 2021. This was a global phenomenon hitting every advanced economy because pandemic lockdowns shattered supply chains worldwide. Russia invaded Ukraine, sending energy prices into the stratosphere, and corporate profit margins exploded as companies used the chaos as cover to jack up prices beyond what input costs required. But wait, because here comes the truly Orwellian dimension of Trump's current inflation gaslighting campaign, and tariffs are raising about $30 billion per month in revenue for U.S. coffers, but the new import taxes levied by the Trump administration have increased prices on a number of items from food to clothing to furniture. The tariffs amount to an average tax increase of $1,200 per U.S. household in 2025, with the weighted average applied tariff rate on all imports rising to 15.8%, the highest average rate since 1943, and representing the largest U.S. tax increase as a percent of GDP since 1993. Do you understand what this means? Trump is actively pursuing policies that economists across the political spectrum agree are inflationary, while simultaneously claiming that inflation concerns are a democratic hoax. This is consciousness manipulation at the level of demanding you deny physical reality itself. Some 57% of voters said in a Harvard Capps-Harris poll that Trump was losing the battle against inflation, while 68% of respondents to an AP NORC poll said the economy was poor or very poor. The American people know something is fundamentally wrong here. They feel it every time they buy groceries or fill up their gas tank or pay their electricity bill. Many categories have seen steadily increasing inflation during Trump's second term. including electricity up 6.2% from August 2024 to August 2025, used vehicles up 6%, medical care up 3.4%, groceries up 2.7%, and durable goods up 1.9%. So when this spokesperson stands there telling you Trump has made America affordable again, she is literally asking you to participate in a collective delusion. Let's excavate the Biden economic record, because context is how we resist historical revisionism, and yes, inflation peaked above 9% in June 2022 and has stayed above the Federal Reserve's 2% target every month since March 2021. Nobody disputes that inflation was real and painful. But by the time Trump took office, inflation had been trending steadily down toward the Federal Reserve's desired 2% annual rate, having fallen from 7.2% in June 2022 to 2.4% in November 2024, with inflation cooling in the past 6 months to an annualized rate of around 2%, and food prices increasing by only 1.4% from November 2023 to November 2024, down from their peak increase of more than 12% in August 2022. Biden handed Trump an economy that was achieving what economists call a soft landing, bringing inflation down without triggering recession, something incredibly rare and difficult. The intellectual dishonesty here operates through what I call temporal sleight of hand, where they take the peak of pandemic disruption inflation under Biden and compare it to current numbers under Trump, while deliberately erasing the downward trajectory that was already well established. This is methodologically fraudulent, it's statistically manipulative, it's designed to construct a before and after narrative that has no relationship to actual causation. Overall inflation was 21.2% during the 4 years Biden was in office, and in terms of buying power, inflation split Biden's presidency into a wipeout phase from April 2021 through May 2023, when real earnings were negative, and a recovery phase when real earnings turned positive in June 2023 and stayed that way. But the recovery came too late for Biden, and Democrats absolutely failed to communicate economic reality effectively. They failed to meet people's material pain with aggressive enough policy responses. But that political failure doesn't justify Trump administration officials now rewriting recent history as if Biden personally caused global pandemic supply disruptions. While the annual inflation rate reached a 4-decade high of 9.1% in June 2022, that was far from the modern record for the Consumer Price Index of 14.6% in 1980, and by the time Trump took office, inflation had been trending steadily down toward the Federal Reserve's desired 2% annual rate. So this rhetoric about Biden presiding over the worst inflation crisis in over 4 decades is technically accurate for that peak moment, but deliberately strips away all context about what caused it, how it compared historically, and what trajectory it was on when Biden left office. This is propaganda technique 101. Take a factoid, isolate it from all context, and weaponize it to construct an emotional narrative disconnected from systemic analysis. And now Trump's own tariff policies threaten to reignite inflation just as the Federal Reserve was succeeding in bringing it under control. According to analysis from the Harvard Business School Pricing Lab, the price of imported goods rose about 4% between March and September 25, while domestic goods rose 2%, with analysis from the Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis finding that tariffs explain roughly 0.5 percentage points of headline inflation from June to August 2025. In April, a universal 10 to 25% import tariff sparked immediate pressure on consumer prices, contributing to an inflation rate of about 2.7% in June, up from 2.4% in May, with the rate rising to 3% in September, the highest it's been since January, and Deloitte forecasts average CPI growth will hit around 2.9% in 2025 and accelerate to about 3.2% in 2026 if tariffs remain elevated. We are watching in real time as Trump's signature economic policy creates the exact affordability crisis he claims is a Democratic hoax. The political stakes here are absolutely existential, because when administrations can brazenly lie about easily verifiable economic data and face no accountability from their base, that's not just spin. That's the construction of what Hannah Arendt called a fact-free politics, where the goal isn't to convince you of an alternative interpretation, but to destroy the very possibility of shared reality. Senator Elizabeth Warren said Democrats paid the price for not being honest about what was happening in people's lives, and that Trump runs the risk that the more he tells people that the world is different from how they experience it, the more they will turn on him. But here's the terrifying question. Will they? Or have we reached a point where partisan identity so overwhelms material experience that people will endorse narratives that directly contradict their own economic suffering if those narratives come wrapped in the right ideological packaging? The fact that the inflation rate 8 months into Trump's term was unchanged from the one he inherited has debunked his triumphant claims, but Trump's team has chosen to use misleading comparisons, deploying apples to oranges sets of statistics to serve Trump's point. When the White House says inflation has slowed to a 2.5% average pace, they're citing an average of 8 months of inflation rates from February through September, after being reminded of the actual rate for January, and that 8-month average conveniently understates the current inflation challenge because it incorporates lower rates from Trump's first 3 months back in office, before the president announced his sweeping global tariffs in early April. This is not good faith policy debate. This is statistical manipulation designed to construct propaganda talking points for surrogates to deploy in clips exactly like the one we just watched. What makes this particularly insidious is how it weaponizes real economic pain that people experienced under Biden, pain that was legitimate and deserves acknowledgement, but redirects all that suffering toward partisan mythology rather than structural analysis. People struggling to afford groceries don't need to be told inflation is a hoax. They need policies that address wage stagnation, housing costs, healthcare expenses, childcare costs, all the ways that neoliberal capitalism has gutted working-class economic security over decades. But instead we get this performance where a spokesperson stands in front of cameras and constructs an alternate reality where Trump single-handedly rescued America from Biden's economic apocalypse, when many voters are questioning how well Trump is tackling stubbornly high costs of everyday items, with polls showing just 33% of adults approving of Trump's handling of the economy. The broader pattern here connects to what scholars call authoritarian epistemology, where power doesn't argue with truth, but rather asserts the right to define truth through force of will and repetition. You see it in how this spokesperson doesn't engage with economic data or respond to critiques, but simply asserts claims with performative confidence, trusting that repetition and partisan media amplification will override factual rebuttal. Trump went on a lying spree about inflation, claiming every price is down and prices are down substantially when none of that is true, as prices are up during this administration, with average prices 1.7% higher in September than in January and 3% higher than in September 2024, with inflation every month of the term and far more products getting costlier than cheaper. This isn't spin. This isn't exaggeration. This is just flat-out lying about easily checkable facts, and doing so with the confidence that comes from knowing a significant portion of the electorate will never check. We need to understand that this kind of economic gaslighting has real consequences for democratic governance, because when citizens can't agree on basic facts about inflation rates or wage growth or unemployment numbers, then we can't have meaningful debates about policy responses, we can't hold leaders accountable for economic outcomes, we can't build coalitions around shared material interests. Instead, we get tribal epistemologies where Team Red believes one set of claims and Team Blue believes another, and never the twain shall meet. This is the death spiral of deliberative democracy, and we're watching it accelerate in real time. Political pollster Frank Luntz said Trump blaming Biden for failures of the economy may have worked during campaign season, but now a year since the election, the public expects this administration to take charge, and at a certain point they will not accept the blame game. But will that certain point ever arrive, or have we entered a permanent state of partisan reality construction? The progressive response here cannot simply be to fact-check the lies. Though that's necessary, we need to understand that this spokesperson and the apparatus she represents are engaged in a form of epistemic warfare, designed to make factual reality itself a partisan question. We need to rebuild institutions of shared truth. We need to support independent journalism. We need to teach media literacy. We need to create spaces where people can encounter perspectives beyond their filter bubbles. And most fundamentally, we need to address the underlying economic precarity that makes people vulnerable to these kinds of manipulative narratives in the first place. When people are struggling to survive, they become susceptible to any story that promises relief, any villain to blame, any savior to follow. This is how authoritarianism has always operated, and it's exactly what we're watching now. Trump has falsely claimed there is no inflation, and called the broader issue of affordability the greatest con job, and a Democratic hoax, with economists saying it was Trump's own tariffs that have led inflation to accelerate this year. So we have an administration that is simultaneously causing inflation through its trade policies while denying that inflation exists, while blaming Democrats for inventing inflation concerns. This is triple-level reality distortion, and it should alarm anyone who cares about democratic accountability. Getting inflation to slow down or prices to drop will be easier said than done for the Trump administration, which has embraced economic policies such as tariffs that force prices upward, with tariffs raising about $30 billion per month. but increasing prices on numerous items, we are headed for a collision between Trump's economic promises and economic reality. And when that collision happens, the question is whether his base will finally reject the gaslighting, or whether partisan identity will prove stronger than material self-interest. This clip represents everything dangerous about contemporary conservative political communication: the confident assertion of demonstrably false claims, the construction of before and after narratives that erase all causal complexity, the weaponization of legitimate economic anxiety toward partisan ends, the complete unwillingness to acknowledge any nuance or context or complicating evidence. In warning signs for the GOP, November's odd-year races saw Democrats who campaigned on affordability win major contests in New York City, Virginia, and New Jersey. Voters are starting to notice the disconnect between Trump's claims and their lived reality, but whether that translates into sustained political accountability remains an open and genuinely terrifying question, because if Trump can lie this blatantly about inflation while his own policies make it worse and face no consequences, then we have moved beyond politics as usual into genuinely authoritarian territory where power simply asserts reality and dares anyone to contradict it. The path forward requires both immediate tactical responses and longer-term structural transformation. We need to relentlessly fact-check these lies. We need to amplify economist voices explaining actual inflation dynamics. We need to highlight how Trump's tariffs are raising costs. We need to tell stories of real people struggling under Trump's economy. But we also need to build an alternative economic vision that addresses the deep structural inequalities making people so economically precarious in the first place. We need to talk about how corporate consolidation enables price gouging, how inadequate antitrust enforcement allows monopolistic behavior, how wage stagnation has divorced productivity from compensation, how housing costs have exploded due to treating homes as investment vehicles rather than human rights, how healthcare costs bankrupt families because we refuse to treat health as a public good. This is the conversation we should be having, but instead we're trapped in this reality distortion field where Trump spokespersons can just assert whatever they want and expect partisan media to amplify it uncritically. Every single person watching this clip needs to understand they're witnessing propaganda construction in real time. This is how authoritarian movements operate. They take legitimate grievances like inflation pain. They construct simplified villain-hero narratives. They make promises disconnected from policy reality. They blame predecessors for problems they inherit and take credit for trends they didn't create. And they do it all with such confidence that people who desperately want to believe will believe despite all evidence. The antidote is not just fact-checking, though we need that. The antidote is building economic security so people aren't so vulnerable to these manipulations, building media literacy so people can recognize propaganda techniques, building solidarity across tribal divides so we can find common cause and shared material interests, and building democratic institutions strong enough to hold power accountable even when power tries to define reality itself. This fight is not just about inflation data. It's about whether we will have a shared factual basis for democratic deliberation, or whether we will descend into competing reality tunnels where facts become just another partisan weapon. And make no mistake, the stakes could not possibly be higher.